stay up in the NHL and have this career.
Over a brutal 4-month stretch, the hockey world lost 3 of its legendary tough guys. Wade Belak was the final devastating blow in that tragic sequence. It was never really about taking a punch to the jaw. The real demon was the mounting dread, a suffocating anxiety you shove down into the darkest corners of your mind until you convince yourself it does not even exist. But the moment you hang up your skates for good, the stadium lights fade and every single buried nightmare comes rushing back to the surface. This is the raw, unflinching story of how professional hockey's most punishing and unforgiving job slowly dismantled a beloved figure who always wore a bulletproof smile. He accepted the brutal reality of his role simply because he craved the opportunity to stick around in the big leagues and carve out a lasting professional career for himself. Entering the world in Saskatoon, his family relocated to the tiny community of Battleford, Saskatchewan by the time he turned 6 years old. He grew up surrounded by freezing small-town ice arenas, just another young kid gripping a hockey stick and chasing the ultimate fantasy that practically every child up north shares. Fast forward to the 1994 National Hockey League Draft. The Quebec Nordiques selected him 12th overall in the very first round. That kind of high draft pick is never just a wild guess on raw talent, it is a massive organizational statement about a player's perceived ceiling. Wade Belak was drafted with the expectation of becoming a legitimate cornerstone superstar, yet the professional leagues had a much darker path laid out for him. His skating lacked that elite breakaway speed, needed to consistently find the back of the net, and his hands simply were not soft enough to serve as a top-tier facilitator. Because of those limitations, he adapted by transforming into the exact type of player that nobody actually dreams of becoming, yet absolutely every single championship contender desperately requires the resident enforcer. He became the human meat shield, throwing bare knuckles so the highly paid superstars could skate untouched a gritty journey spanning 549 games across 5 different franchises. Bouncing from Colorado to Calgary, then Toronto, Florida, and finally Nashville, he ground his way through 14 grueling seasons of elite-level competition. Looking at his career statistics reveals the whole picture, a mere 8 goals scored completely overshadowed by 1,263 minutes spent sitting in the penalty box. Those lopsided numbers paint a perfectly brutal picture of his daily office duties on the ice, but once he stepped out of the arena, he was an entirely different human being. He tied the knot with Jennifer Russell back in 2002, and the couple eventually welcomed 2 beautiful daughters into the world, Andy and Alex. Friends and family unanimously describe a deeply devoted family man who rarely let his girls out of his arms, constantly showering them with affection and unwavering presence. Eventually, as all those years of sheer physical trauma began taking an undeniable toll on his aging frame, he refused to just fade into obscurity. Instead, he completely reinvented his professional trajectory. Snagging television broadcasting gigs up north and hosting a popular radio program down in Tennessee, he proved to be incredibly witty on screen and sharply charismatic behind a microphone, boasting that rare magnetic charm that audiences instantly connect with. Heading into the sweltering summer months of 2011, he was actually locked in to star on a massive national television figure skating competition. It represented a totally fresh beginning and a vibrant new public persona, proving there could be a fulfilling existence after a lifetime of throwing heavy haymakers. To anyone watching from the sidelines, it genuinely appeared as though Wade Belak had successfully navigated the treacherous post-retirement waters and constructed a rock-solid, meaningful second act. Over his professional tenure, Wade Belak squared off in 136 sanctioned brawls, with the vast majority of those violent clashes wrapping up in less than 20 frantic seconds. But those 20 seconds consisted of eating bone-crushing right hooks to the head delivered by massive heavyweights who were equally enormous, and just as fiercely determined to literally fight for their survival in the league. Afterward, with blood dripping from split knuckles or a shattered nose, you take that lonely skate over to the sin bin, catching your breath on a cold wooden bench, while thousands of rabid fans scream for more violence, fully knowing you might have to repeat the exact same terrifying process before the intermission horn even sounds. The unwritten rules of being an enforcer are absolutely merciless in their simplicity. Your paycheck has absolutely zero connection to lighting the lamp, nor does management compensate you for threading perfectly timed passes. Your singular purpose on the payroll is acting as a human deterrent, guaranteeing that the franchise's elite point producers never have to look over their shoulders. You willingly soak up endless physical abuse so the skilled guys walk away completely clean. You are nothing more than a living armor plate, and in this business, armor plates get swapped out the second they crack. Georges Laraque stood out as arguably the most terrifying and intimidating heavyweight brawler to ever lace up skates in the history of the sport. In the wake of Wade's devastating passing, the legendary tough guy opened up about the genuine horrifying psychological reality of filling that specific roster spot. He admitted that while he performed the duties to collect a paycheck, he absolutely despised every second of it. He loathed throwing punches and felt entirely suffocated by the relentless crushing anxiety. Being labeled a mindless thug or a vicious beast tore at his soul, yet surprisingly the actual physical combat was far from the most damaging aspect of the profession. Laraque elaborated on the immense invisible psychological anchor that professional fighters are forced to drag around with them every single day. It begins the evening before puck drop, stretching into game day, a constant sickening nervousness that leaves you physically trembling and entirely consumed by racing thoughts. You try sitting in a quiet theater to watch a film, but the screen might as well be blank because your brain is completely paralyzed by the terrifying knowledge that tomorrow night you have to trade bare-knuckle blows with a giant like Derek Boogaard. And the scariest part is that the bone-deep terror does not magically evaporate once the final buzzer sounds and you head back to the locker room. You simply train your mind to compartmentalize the horror, stuffing it down into a heavily guarded psychological vault. You bury those feelings so profoundly that you actually lose track of them entirely successfully, brainwashing yourself into believing that you are completely okay. Because the only other option is looking in the mirror and confessing that you mentally cannot handle the single brutal attribute keeping your professional dreams alive. However, the haunting question remains, what occurs the exact moment a career ends? The violence abruptly halts, and all of that repressed trauma is still sitting right there, patiently biding its time. For this beloved tough guy, the on-ice brawling officially concluded in 2011, and by the time Wade reached his 35th birthday, his physical frame was a battered roadmap of sheer brutality, having soaked up an entire professional lifetime of bare-knuckle violence on the ice. Yet there is a dark, unspoken reality about being a designated heavyweight that simply never gets talked about in the sports media. The ultimate grueling challenge for these guys actually has nothing to do with surviving the brutal hits during their playing days. It is figuring out how to survive the jarring transition when they are finally forced to hang up their skates. Whenever a superstar sniper decides to step away from the sport, they certainly lose their sense of direction, grieving the loss of that intense nightly competition and the pure unadulterated adrenaline rush that comes from bearing a puck past the goalie. However, for an enforcer, the psychological toll of retirement rips away something profoundly more fundamental to their soul. Their entire sense of self just evaporates because the singular absolute reason they held any value on a National Hockey League roster was their absolute readiness to step up as a human shield, absorbing devastating blows so the star players could skate freely. Then in the blink of an eye, the buzzer sounds on their career, and absolutely no one in the world requires that bloody sacrifice from them ever again. The texts dry up, the front office goes dead silent, and that all-important phone just flat out stops ringing entirely. That specific violent purpose that carved out their whole adult existence vanishes into thin air, though if you looked strictly at his resume, Wade seemed to be navigating this treacherous transition absolutely flawlessly. He was actively building up a promising presence in sports broadcasting, and he was even locked in to showcase a completely different side of himself on the hit television series Battle of the Blades that upcoming autumn season. It was supposed to be a brilliant second act, trading the bloody isolation of the sin bin for the bright, welcoming lights of a television studio. From an outside perspective, it looked exactly like the ideal, comfortable transition into retirement, yet beneath that charming, smiling exterior, his physical foundation was completely crumbling to pieces. Severe, agonizing arthritis had entrenched itself so deeply throughout his pelvic region that he practically required constant cortisone shots just to manage basic everyday movements. And to make matters worse, the massive toll of every single medical injection would leave him utterly incapacitated, knocking him out of commission for several agonizing days in a row. The final professional blow landed squarely on February 25th, 2011. The Nashville Predators officially threw him on the waiver wire, and in a devastating display of a closed chapter, not one single franchise stepped up to claim him, exactly 11 days after that bitter rejection. When the calendar hit March 8th, Wade formally announced his departure from professional hockey, but the incredibly dark demons he had successfully shoved down into the depths of his mind for 14 grueling seasons absolutely refused to walk away from the sport with him. Sometime after the tragedy, his own mother Lorraine courageously stepped forward to verify that her son had been quietly waging a war against severe clinical depression, while prominent sports broadcaster Michael Landsberg stepped up to add vital context. Landsberg, who has been fiercely vocal and totally transparent about his own exhausting battles with mental illness, disclosed a private conversation where the former enforcer confessed he had been heavily relying on prescribed antidepressant medication for a solid stretch of 4 to 5 years. In classic locker room fashion, the tough guy brushed it off with dark humor, dubbing his medication his little happy pills, expertly playing the role of the jovial giant who completely fooled his fellow players, the relentless media, and his closest buddies into believing everything was perfectly fine. Behind closed doors, though, he was locked in a terrifying cage match against an invisible adversary, one that absolutely no amount of right hooks could ever knock out. This creeping darkness truly did not give a single damn about your reputation as a heavyweight brawler, nor did it care about how many times you fearlessly dropped your gloves at center ice to fire up a stagnant crowd. It forces you to confront a chilling psychological reality. Is it genuinely possible to become such an absolute master of masking your internal agony that you eventually completely lose touch with what real happiness or pain even feels like? If you genuinely want to wrap your head around the complete devastation surrounding the tragedy of Wade Black, you critically need to step back and examine the incredibly toxic landscape of the National Hockey League back in the year 2011. The concept of psychological well-being was an absolutely massive taboo, a subject that was completely swept under the rug and kept far away from any serious locker room discussions. Any hint of emotional vulnerability was immediately stamped as a glaring character flaw, a totally unacceptable trait for a group of gladiators who quite literally justified their multi-million-dollar contracts by projecting an aura of complete invincibility. Bringing up the heavy weight of depression while lacing up your skates in a pro environment was basically an unspoken death sentence for your career. Guys absolutely never ever complained about the blinding migraines that refused to fade away, nor did they dare whisper a word about the violent, unpredictable emotional roller coasters that terrified their families at home. The old school mentality was simple, brutal, and rigidly enforced you bit your tongue, swallowed your immense suffering, and went out to bleed for the logo on the front of your sweater. Meanwhile, the medical community was only just barely beginning to scratch the surface, trying frantically to comprehend the horrific neurological damage these modern-day warriors had been subjected to over decades of combat. The terrifying reality of head trauma was just starting to crack the mainstream sports dialogue, though the media lens was pointed almost exclusively at the brutal gridiron hits over in professional football. The National Football League was facing a massive reckoning, getting hit with massive class action lawsuits brought forward by veterans whose minds had been utterly shattered by thousands of high-speed helmet-to-helmet collisions. Yet somehow the entire hockey establishment was still perfectly content to bury its head deeply in the sand, functioning in a state of sheer arrogant denial. The sport's top executives were absolutely nowhere near ready to openly confess that their designated bare-knuckle brawlers were paying an irreversible fatal toll, a cost that went miles deeper than a few shattered cheekbones and permanently scarred knuckles. In the heartbreaking aftermath of his passing, Wade's family made the incredibly difficult choice to donate his brain to specialized researchers for a comprehensive medical examination. The clinical pathology report came back and effectively validated the absolute worst-case scenario that every single fan and insider had secretly been dreading for months. It was definitive proof of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, commonly known as CTE, which was the exact same relentless brain-destroying disease that had recently ravaged the mind of legendary enforcer Derek Boogaard, and the very same haunting condition that would soon be diagnosed in the tragic case of Rick Ripien. Every single one of these three beloved tough guys walked around with the exact same catastrophic, irreversible neurological trauma quietly destroying them from the inside out. The cruelest irony of all was that the specific athletes tasked with absorbing the most savage concussive violence out on the ice were the ones left entirely abandoned, completely lacking the medical resources necessary to survive. Completely failed by a flawed system structurally cut adrift by the sport's outdated machismo culture, and entirely unarmed when it came to battling the horrific mental ghosts that all of that physical trauma eventually summoned. As Michael Landsberg so profoundly articulated during his tributes, it highlighted a devastating impossible paradox that ultimately served as the heartbreaking legacy of the larger-than-life friend he had lost. Wade possessed this mind-blowing talent for looking like the absolute life of the party, hiding the brutal reality that he was battling darker demons than anyone else around him. Former tough guy Nick Capreos, who actually lived in the same neighborhood as him during their stint in Toronto, broke down exactly why guys who threw punches for a living never shared their baggage with one another. You simply do not sit around dumping your deepest anxieties about being a human punching bag onto another dude whose entire career depends on doing the exact same brutal thing. You quickly learn that keeping your mouth shut is about way more than just fitting into locker room culture. It is literally a matter of professional life and death. Confessing that your mind was falling apart was essentially handing in your resignation, because the moment management thought you were soft, your spot on the roster was gone forever. The most devastating piece of this whole tragedy is not the fact that he kept his agony buried deep down inside for so many years. What really breaks your heart is that the big guy had finally started opening up, even telling an interviewer on national television about the daily pills he took just to get out of bed. He was actively stepping up and owning his mental health battles. He was genuinely fighting to get better, which turns the final chapter of his story into a gut-wrenching pill that hockey fans still struggle to swallow today. On July 18, 2011, the Enforcer touched down in the city of Toronto, gearing up for his highly anticipated debut on Battle of the Blades. For those who do not remember, this was a massive television spectacle up north that strapped figure skates onto legendary hockey brawlers, pairing them up with professional dancers for a wildly popular reality competition. The casting directors ultimately teamed him up with Kim Navarro, an incredibly decorated American figure skater, and the two strangers finally crossed paths for an initial meet and greet down in the main lobby of their hotel. What was supposed to be a quick handshake completely snowballed into an epic hours-long conversation that stretched deep into the night. He poured his heart out to his new partner, hyping up his life back in Nashville, buzzing about his growing radio career, and gushing relentlessly about how much he loved his wife and kids. She headed up to her room, completely stoked, entirely convinced she had struck absolute gold with a partner who was going to make the grueling television schedule an absolute blast. Over the following month, he was an absolute machine in constant motion, ping-ponging constantly between brutal choreography sessions on the ice, heavy promotional duties for the network, and grabbing beers with the massive network of close buddies he had collected across his hockey career. Every single buddy who hung out with him during that late summer stretch swore up and down that he was the exact same lovable giant he had always been. He was vibrating with energy, hyper-focused, and roasting his friends with that massive infectious grin that made him a fan favorite in the first place. At 11:29 at night on August 30th, the former heavyweight fired off a quick text message to Jeremy Benfield, the guy producing his sports radio segments down in Tennessee. The text was totally mundane and strictly business, just confirming he would be back in the studio that upcoming Friday night. He had his entire weekend itinerary mapped out and was fully stoked to get back behind the microphone. A little bit later that evening, locals spotted him hanging out at the Underground Garage, a famously rowdy watering hole packed right into the vibrant heart of King Street West. People drinking nearby noted that he finally closed out his tab and walked out the door around 2 in the morning looking incredibly upbeat and entirely at peace. There was absolutely zero indication that a storm was brewing. Bright and early the next morning, he had a block of time booked for a high-profile morning radio hit. A scheduled town car idled outside the front glass of his building, waiting for him to hop in, but the massive enforcer never walked through those doors. Producers back at the broadcast studio just brushed it off, naturally assuming the big man had simply slept through his alarm clock or accidentally double-booked his morning. Right around 1:40 in the afternoon on August 31st, 2011, management at the One King West Hotel finally keyed into his luxury suite to do a routine welfare check, and that is where they found his lifeless body. He was only 35 years old, and this devastating blow landed a mere 16 days after fellow enforcer Rick Rypien was discovered dead inside his house out in Alberta. Furthermore, this nightmare unfolded barely 3.5 months after the towering Derek Boogaard suffered a fatal overdose alone in his Minneapolis apartment. 3 legendary heavyweights absolutely wiped off the map in a single summer season. Every single one of them was under 40 years of age, and now they were all gone forever. The entire hockey ecosystem did not just cry over the loss. A dark, suffocating paralysis washed over every single locker room from coast to coast. It was that crushing heavy guilt that hits a community right in the gut when everybody collectively realizes they were completely blind to the giant flashing warning signs right in front of them. The very guys throwing back drinks with him a few hours prior had zero clue they were looking at a man standing right on the edge of the cliff. Yet the men wearing suits at the commissioner's office could no longer pretend this was just a bizarre string of unrelated bad luck. Barely a few days after the news of his death shattered the sports landscape, the executives and the players' union stepped up to the podium and finally said the quiet part out loud to the press. They publicly declared that these heartbreaking casualties demanded immediate aggressive action, swearing to rip the lid off the underlying darkness, destroying their toughest athletes. For the absolute first time in the history of the sport, the toxic tough guy culture gave way to actual concrete medical protocols, forcing the front office to radically expand their psychological and addiction safety nets. They started pouring massive funding into rescuing the exact same vulnerable men whose hidden traumas old school coaches used to mock as nothing more than pathetic weakness. Franchises all across the National Hockey League finally started bringing professional sports psychologists on board, waking up to the harsh reality that these athletes desperately required mental and emotional backing that went way beyond what athletic trainers and equipment managers could provide. Tough guys and retired enforcers slowly started stepping up to the microphone, shedding light on the absolute hell they had privately endured behind closed doors. Heavyweight Georges Larac completely dropped his guard, speaking incredibly candidly about needing serious clinical therapy once his brutal playing days came to a close. Then you had guys like Chris Nealon, a man who waged a massive life or death war against severe substance addiction after spending years as one of the most notoriously terrifying brawlers in the history of the sport, completely transforming himself into a fiercely dedicated mental health advocate. The toxic old school code of silence that had kept locker rooms sealed tight for generations was finally beginning to shatter. Down in Nashville during Wade's incredibly heavy funeral service, legendary tough guy Ty Domi took the podium and laid out exactly what desperately needed to shift in the hockey world. He made it crystal clear that this is all about battling clinical depression and making sure the absolute right message gets broadcasted to the guys in the trenches. He hammered home the point that depression is a fight that can actually be won if you tackle it head on. Ty pointed out that Wade had isolated himself and stressed that you simply cannot fight those dark internal battles all by yourself. Looking back over the 10 years that followed, the classic enforcer gig practically evaporated from the modern game. A wave of sweeping rule changes systematically stripped bare-knuckle brawling out of the sport's core identity. Lineups became blindingly fast, heavily focused on elite puck skills, and significantly less dependent on raw physical intimidation to get the job done. The heavy toll of paying guys whose sole purpose was to go out there and absorb catastrophic head trauma became utterly impossible to justify anymore. We are not just talking about the financial burden, but the massive moral weight of it all. The absolute warriors who laced up their skates long before Wade ever did ended up paying the ultimate price for that cultural evolution, sacrificing their own bodies and deteriorating minds. Tragically, they never even got the chance to witness the safer, modernized league that their suffering helped build. But it is crucial to remember that Wade Belak was far more than just some grim cautionary tale. Here was a heavyweight enforcer who willingly dropped the gloves and shed blood for his teammates night after grueling night, while simultaneously fighting a profoundly darker, much more terrifying battle completely in the shadows. Canadian sports broadcaster Michael Landsberg once penned a remarkably poignant thought about this specific tragedy, and that phrasing has essentially haunted me ever since. He tackled the devastating illusion of the word fine. It is just 4 simple letters, an automatic reflex of an answer, but within the ultra-tough culture of professional hockey, claiming you are doing fine absolutely does not mean you are actually okay. The brutal reality is that he was nowhere near okay. Exactly 7 days after he gave that reassurance, he was dead. We know he put up a hell of a fight behind closed doors to get better, but tragically, all of that agonizing effort simply was not enough to save his life. That heavy, devastating devastating fact is the exact nightmare that hockey fans are forced to sit with and process. Before we close the book on this deep dive, we have to send a massive wave of gratitude to the absolute legends in our community who make producing these intense sports retrospectives completely worthwhile. Huge shoutouts go to Visually Impaired Gamer, 1987, Rebel TDR6046, Danny Avery, 5578, the crew over at Weibo Show. And of course, the user famously known as Daryl Sutter's favorite cow. You folks know exactly who you are, and we recognize your fierce loyalty every single day. These documentary projects only keep breathing because of diehard puck fans just like you. If this emotional trip through the ice meant something profound to you, we have turned on the Super Thanks feature down below. Dropping a tip through that button is hands down the most impactful way you can fuel the gritty research we put together here. Every single dollar you contribute gets poured directly into uncovering and producing the next unforgettable saga of hockey history that desperately needs to be dragged out of the shadows and told to the public.